Welcome, everyone. Thanks to everyone who's showing up to this very special event with giants of the human rights world who have dedicated their lives to defend human rights, especially in a place that is very unique if you're working for it, which is Palestine. Human rights defenders, experts, and special rapporteurs who have worked and who continue to work on Palestine maybe find it more difficult than other defenders of human rights and other experts and other special rapporteurs because of the unfortunate reality that is around the Palestinian human rights field and the attacks that in many cases people have to go through only because they are defending human rights. So it's really a great honor for me today to be introducing our very distinguished colleagues, Professors Richard Falk, Professor John Dugard, and Michael Lynk, the three professors and experts who have written their recent book, Protecting Human Rights in Occupied Palestine, working through the United Nations. But before we start with speaking about this book and discussing it and understanding what this book is about and learning more about their experiences with the human rights defense in Palestine, we are going to start by an introduction by the current special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory, Professor Francesca Albanese, who is very actively working currently on the Palestine file, being very close to the victims, very close to the civil society, bringing out all the issues. So she's struggling the struggle that her predecessors have gone through in the past. She took the torch and she's running very strongly with it. So I will ask Francesca to address us, all of us, before we start with the rest of this event. And then I will ask our distinguished guests, our distinguished speakers to, I will have a conversation with them, asking them questions about the book, but also about their experience defending human rights in Palestine. So dear Francesca, please start with your introduction. I know you've introduced the book in a written form as well. So we would like to also hear from you, verbally, what you think about the book, maybe some reflection about the mandate itself. I'm looking forward to hear from you, please.
Good afternoon or good evening, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Munir, a dear colleague and friend. And I'm very happy to be once again with my distinguished predecessors, friends, and as I often say, guardian angels, because the three special rapporteurs are always there when I need advice and comfort for carrying this torch. With it's an infelicitous work at times, let's admit it. Let's start on a positive note. I was very happy and honored to walk in the steps of Professor John Dugard, Professor Richard Falk, and Professor Michael Lynk as the first woman special rapporteur. But I was also very happy that they asked me to contribute a foreword to their book, which is absolutely amazing. I cannot recommend more strongly. And those who know me know that I'm not just making a compliment. I really mean it. Because I had the chance to read the book before anyone else. And by the way, I apologize for the background noise. I'm in an airport. So look, I think that this book is exceptional in many ways. because of the nature, the character, the scholarship of each individual contributor as a legal expert, and also because of them being special rapporteurs who served on this mandate one after the other. And I commented on my foreword to the book that I really believe it's a staple in any scholar's library on the question of Palestine. Because just as a legal reading, forget about the work of special rapporteur, I think it really contributes to uplift and shift the debate on the question of Palestine, which is often encroached by prejudice and polarize the narratives, while through the work of the three special rapporteurs, as it's captured and crystallized in the book, you can see that, in fact, what it's very much needed, it's a holistic approach to international law and to the facts, leading to the facts which are often missing from the dominant debate. And I point also to the fact that this is a really relevant scholarly contribution, because there is a sort of neo-formalism, or what I call legal orthodoxy, which in the pursuit of rigor in certain disciplines, IHL only or human rights only, has sacrificed the context, has missed, as I often say, the forest for the trees, rendering a legal reading of the situation, which is often ahistorical and decontextualized. With this introduction, I think that what I found, the three main contributions of the book are coming from three special rapporteurs that therefore shed light to the innovative, powerful function of this human rights voice, with independent human rights voice within the UN family. So are three aspects. And the first is that you can capture through the book the worsening of the situation on the ground across 2 decades. There is no question of that. The dispossession, displacement, the encroaching of the settlements, and the increasing brutality of the apartheid practices that John Dugard announced in 2006, and then it has continued until Michael Lynk produced his final report, which argued, which enforced, which enhanced the legal reading of others. So we can see that there is a negative trend that has taken place. Against this background, the second element, you can see that each of the rapporteur faced similar struggles and similar challenges, but at the same time, different personalities brought up different success stories through their mandate. And the third element is that, and then I'll come back to the second point, because it's important, and this is the note on which I want to conclude. The third element is that I really believe that the three special rapporteurs, individually and collectively, show how there is no other way around than respecting the primacy of international law, justice, and accountability to solve the current tragic reality in the occupied Palestinian territory, both to the benefit of both Palestinians and Israelis. No other way around, because international law is not one of the options, one of the alternatives on the manual of conflict resolutions. This is what is to perimeter the scope and action of political maneuver or maneuvering. Let me conclude by saying that when I said in the second part, I think that the second relevant aspect is how each mandate holder faced on his own accord challenges and brought up some originality, is that I really believe that it's interesting to see how the three of them operated and how I fit into this, because John Dugard was the first special rapporteur on this mandate, who really used a powerful voice to denounce abuses and violations, but did it in a soft-spoken fashion, because this is very much in John's nature. Richard continued with the same rigor and precision, bringing eloquent prose to the discussion. But being the fierce jurist he is, he was incendiary to many, so he revolutionized the discussion. And Michael, sort of with his personality and his precision and his chirurgical approach, could sort of bring together what his predecessors had done, and in a soft-spoken fashion come out with this very powerful j'accuse, pointing to the legality of the occupation and to the collective punishment that many of the manifestations of the occupation turn out in, and also the responsibility of the enablers. Voila, this is my inheritance from my predecessors, and which I hope I continue in a dignified fashion among the adversities. Thank you so much. And I won't be able to be with you for the entire length of the meeting, because I will have to catch a plane, but I will be here as long as possible. Thank you, Munir.
Thank you very much, Francesca. We are really honored to have you with us today in this event, and thank you for allowing time while you're in the middle of your travel to be with us. It really means a lot to us, so we really appreciate it. So this event has been organized by the Al-Quds Human Rights Clinic in Al-Quds University in collaboration and partnership with Law for Palestine. So I would like to thank, my name is Munir Nusseibeh from Al-Quds University. I would like to also thank our partners and friends who I'm honored also to work with as a trustee in Law for Palestine. Thank you very much, Ihsan, Adel, Ghadir and Hadil for your great contribution. So now I would like to start asking our distinguished three speakers about the book, and I'll start by asking Richard, who has served in the past as a UN Special Rapporteur in the human rights situation on the occupied Palestinian territory. I learned that the idea of the book was your idea. Why did you come up with this idea? How did you think about it? Can you maybe tell me more about the idea of writing this book?
Thank you, Munir, and I want to thank on behalf of the three of us the sponsors of this event. It means a lot to us to have this opportunity. The idea of the book came to me because I thought there was an unusual value in what Francesca just described, the evolution of the experience over a 20-year period, which is more revealing than our separate 6-year terms as special rapporteurs, and that it clearly confirmed the deteriorating human rights situation in occupied Palestine. And the three of us who knew each other previously were sufficiently intellectually and ideologically compatible that I thought that it would be which it turned out to be, a harmonious collaboration, which you cannot always take for granted, I've also discovered. So what this collaboration brought out into the open were two things that are not often commented upon. The first thing is this gradual acceptance of a different political discourse relevant for a description of the Palestinian ordeal. It had shifted from a mainstream kind of human rights assessment to the language of settler colonialism and especially apartheid. And that's very significant because it's calling a spade and making us aware of the analogy to the racist regime in South Africa that mobilized the international community. And the second thing I think is worth noticing, and it's been particularly evident in the experiences after John Dugard, though it started, I think, because of the effectiveness of his term as special rapporteur. Israel changed its tactics. It had previously made efforts to substantively address criticism. But after, just at the outset, I suppose, of my term in 2008, Israel deliberately used this means of responding to criticism by trying to shift the conversation, to shift it from the substantive messages to the alleged lack of credibility of those that were delivering the message. So from the message to the messenger was a tactic which I believe exposed Israel's substantive vulnerability to criticism. It couldn't meet the criticism on its own ground, and so it resorted to this smearing tactic, of which it engaged with great intensity throughout my term, and maybe to a somewhat lesser extent during Michael's term, and revived very ferociously during Francesca's term. And I believe it was a combination of the fact that they couldn't respond substantively in any persuasive manner, and the fact that this special rapporteurship gradually gained influence and became an important source of understanding the situation. And it was partly inflamed by this Israel tactic of using anti-Semitism as a weapon, led the media to take more interest in the mandate, and that had a perverse effect of increasing its influence. One final thing I'd say is that John Dugard was the last of the special rapporteurs, including Francesca, to be able to visit the occupied territory. And that's a great loss. It's also unlawful for Israel to refuse to cooperate with the UN in the discharge of its official functions. And again, it represents an effort by Israel not to accord the special rapporteurs with the credibility of having direct experience of the oppressive regime that is present there and has become ever more oppressive really after Michael Lynk's term expired. So I would say that this project has value in the sense of illuminating the oppressive character of the occupation and showing that that illumination rests on careful documentation and an objective approach. And it's sort of unique for the Human Rights Council, which has never, to my knowledge, had such a collaboration in any of its 29 mandates previously. So let me stop there. I hope I haven't talked too long.
No, not at all. So maybe I would like to ask John, could you maybe tell me what are the main obstacles that a special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory faces? Is John here? Ah, yes, John is here. Please, John, you need to unmute yourself. Yeah, yes.
Thank you for inviting me. I hope that my internet connection will last. Let me just begin by saying that I was in the unique situation that I was allowed to visit both Palestine and Israel throughout my 7 years as mandate holder. And that meant that there were fewer obstacles placed in the way of my special rapporteurship than in the case of subsequent rapporteurs. Indeed, I had more or less full cooperation on the part of the Israeli authorities. I was even allowed on one occasion to address the Knesset on the subject of punitive house
I think Professor Dugard's connection.
Opinion. So that was the main focus of my attention. I did also focus on apartheid, which we will come to later. But talking about obstacles, I must confess that I found no obstacles in the way of from the UN when it came to UN agencies on the ground in Palestine. But I found that there were Israeli moles almost in both Geneva and in United Nations in New York, particularly in New York, where some of the senior members of the Secretariat made it very clear to me that they were opposed to the decision to request an advisory opinion. And on other issues too, they did place obstacles in the way of the mandate. So my obstacles came more from the United Nations, particularly New York, rather than from the Israeli government.
Thank you. So that was quite a unique situation compared to the experience of special rapporteurs today. We had a little bit of a cut, but I think we managed to get the gist of what your answer was. So I would like to ask Michael, I know that you've examined very closely the experience of your predecessors, and you've worked also quite closely with the civil society. I've had the fortune of being in touch with you, of having several discussions with you, and also working, arranging for victims to be able to meet you. And by the end of your mandate, you issued very many important reports, but I'm gonna mention the last one. in which you examined the apartheid status of the commission of the apartheid violation and crime in the occupied Palestinian territory. This is something already Richard has talked about in his intervention, but I would like to ask you, maybe if you can talk more about how did you get to this conclusion, and how do you compare the analysis, the human rights analysis, when it comes to Palestine in the past and today? Are we going forward? Are we becoming really more holistic and more comprehensive in the way that we're looking at the problem?
Thank you for that question. And again, like Richard and John, thank you very much for having us on this broadcast. We've done several of these panels, mainly in the United States, but also in England. But it's a great honor to be hosted by a virtual panel based in Palestine. You're asking me about, I guess, the rise of the use of the term apartheid, and it's. I suppose the best thing about what's happened in the last 2 to 3 years is the new climate of opinion among the international and regional human rights movement, that there is virtual wall-to-wall consensus that apartheid exists. Now, depending on who you may talk to, they may say apartheid exists in the West Bank. I believe that's the analysis from Yashdin. Others will say apartheid exists in the occupied Palestinian territories, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, which is what I had said and what I think Al-Haq has said. And I've said that because that was the extent of my geographic mandate as special rapporteur. Other organizations, including monumental reports given by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, as well as a wonderful statement by B'Tselem, have all said that apartheid exists between the river and the sea, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. And their argument basically is you can't have apartheid there and democracy here, that it's integral. It's an integral and closely tied system. And if you look at it in a holistic way, it's part of a strategic fragmentation that Israel has imposed upon the Palestinians, separating the roughly 2 million Palestinians who are citizens of Israel from the 360,000 Palestinians living in East Jerusalem with residency rights but no citizenship rights, from the 2.7 million Palestinians who live in fragmented territory in the West Bank, all of whom are separated from the 2.2 million Palestinians living in Gaza. And then there are the Palestinians who live in the refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and of course the wider Palestinian diaspora. They're separated from each other geographically, to some degree politically, and this is Israel's method of being able to rule. So when I turned to thinking about what my last report was going to be, Munir, I reflected on the fact of how far I had come. When I first became special rapporteur in the spring of 2016, I had said to myself, and I'm quite happy to say this, that I was never going to touch the word or the term apartheid. I said that will only close doors of diplomats and political decision makers to me, and I have plenty of tools rooted in international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and also international criminal law. This is the law that the West has agreed to. I should be able to go to these diplomatic and political leaders in the global North, persuade them with respect to their own tools, and say this is what's happening in Palestine. And as my term was reaching its end, I began to say to myself, I think I've written some decent reports here, but I think I've built strong relationships with civil society movements in Palestine and Israel and globally. But boy, I haven't moved decision makers very much at all with respect to diplomats and political decision makers. And I said, I think some truth telling is needed here. So when I delivered my final report to the Human Rights Council 13 months ago in March of 2022, I said to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, I said, I would not be here today delivering a report detailing how the occupation has shifted into annexation, has shifted into apartheid. Had the international community, and particularly the global North, taken steps 45 and 35 years ago with your already plentiful volume of resolutions at the United Nations, and actually acted upon them, actually imposed accountability, actually stopped Israel from continuing to build its settlements and to have realized Palestinian self-determination. If you had done what international law compels you to do, and if you had done what your own UN resolution said you done, we would have had Palestinian self-determination realized many, many years ago. We would not be today talking about how this occupation has thickened into formal apartheid. So that was, I think, the journey that I took, Munir, on how to come. I want to say, though, I was far from the first to do this, and both of my very esteemed predecessors, John and Richard, had already either written articles or written reports that said this is apartheid. So I was standing on the shoulders of intellectual giants who had come before me with respect to this.
Yes, thank you for this answer. Actually, I have a question I am curious to ask the three of you. As you know, myself, I'm a human rights defender based in Palestine. I work with the Palestinian civil society as well as many other human rights lawyers and activists from different places. And as you know, we face a lot of frustration in our work when it comes to Palestine. Of course, there is a lot of optimism at the same time. We're always trying our best, but as you also mentioned, we always are met with closed ears. I wouldn't say closed doors, because people listen to us. They are always happy to have us for a cup of coffee, to hear what we want to offer and say. But then we don't see how this translates. And then we look at the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court. We also see that while sometimes, the International Court of Justice came up with an advisory opinion about the wall, it's going to come up now with your recommendation, Michael, with a new special advisory opinion on the legality of the occupation. But we always are, we see how there are double standards. What do you recommend for us now, people as you, the three special rapporteurs who have worked for such a long time within the UN system, and you've talked to diplomats and you know how the system works? What would you recommend to us, civil society defenders, who would like to see justice advancing, but are unable to see that because of all these constraints? Let me start with John.
Well, when it comes to the double standard, I think the problem is to overcome the attitudes of the United States and the European Union, Western European states. And that is the real problem. And I think it comes back to the question of Holocaust guilt, that the United States and European states feel guilty about their failure to protect Jews during the Second World War, and so they feel bound to protect the state of Israel. Whereas in the case of South Africa, the West felt that they could take action against South Africa, but there was no Holocaust guilt. On the contrary, many former colonial powers felt guilty that they had applied a system of apartheid themselves. And I think that's really the problem. And I don't quite know how to address this problem, because we have a situation at present when the civil society is very clear that Israel has violated the occupation and that it is practicing a policy of apartheid. But one cannot persuade the West and the United States and Canada and Australia, so it seems, to accept the fact that South Africa is an apartheid state and to take action against it. And that's a very difficult hurdle to overcome. I don't really know the answer to the question of how civil society can persuade the West to adopt a different attitude.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Richard?
Well, of course, I agree with the basic thrust of what John said. I would only add two things. One is that the domestic politics of the U.S. particularly makes support for Israel very difficult to challenge. The AIPAC and the various pro-Israeli groups exert an unhealthy influence over Congress and over even the electoral process in the U.S. So you can't understand the rigidity of the policies without taking into account the domestic realities in the countries that have been most supportive of Israel. And I think the European situation is more sensitive to this issue of guilt than is the US or Australia or the other Canada, the other extremely pro-Israeli countries. The second thing I think that's important to keep in mind is that the UN was designed to be weak when it comes to opposing the powerful P5 and particularly the dominant members of the P5. And that's embodied not only in the veto, but in the whole way in which international law is in effect given very marginal acknowledgement by these countries that in effect can veto any action in the UN that is critical of their behavior. And the last thing I'd mention is that I believe that the Holocaust guilt issue has diminished to some degree, but something else took its place, which was after the 1967 war, Israel was seen as a strategic partner to US interests in the wider region, and especially the access to oil, and that was crucial and became even more important after the Iranian Revolution in '79. And those factors of making Israel appear to be a strategic partner rather than some kind of benefactor of post-Holocaust international politics has been very important in convincing sort of non-sentimental support of Israel despite its behavior that the three of us have emphasized as intolerable from the perspective of international law and human rights law.
Thank you, Richard. Michael, what do you think about my question?
Sure. Well, I will echo what both Richard and John have said with respect to the role of the United States. I mean, this occupation would not be entering or completing its 56th year if it had not been for the decisive role of the United States as both military and diplomatic patron of Israel. If you look at his presidential memoirs, Barack Obama stated that, and this is what Richard, echoing what Richard has said. He said, and I'll quote you specifically. He said, "Picking a fight with Israel exacted a domestic political cost that simply didn't exist when I dealt with the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Japan, Canada, or any of our other closest allies." But when he went on to say, which it shows, I suppose, the split personality of the Obama regime. He said, we were forced in a situation, we American diplomacy, where we and our diplomats had to defend Israeli practices and policies that we ourselves opposed. And it tells you, I suppose, the kind of domestic political clout that organizations like AIPAC would wind up having in shaping American policy that simply doesn't exist with regards to virtually any other issue in American foreign policy. And this results at the Security Council in the United States vetoing, I believe since 1973, the United States has vetoed around 81 resolutions having to do with Israel that are critical of Israel. It's vetoed 81 resolutions in total. 42 of those have to do with Israel, that were critical of Israel. And of those 42, 10 had to do with the Israeli occupation of Lebanon. The rest, the other 32 had to do with the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians. And no other permanent veto-wielding member, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, or France, has ever issued a single veto of a resolution critical of Israel. So it's that vital block and protection and shield that the United States provides at the single most important international decision-making body that has enabled Israel to act with impunity and without accountability with respect to this. There's no situation I can think of in the world where there's such a broad wall-to-wall consensus in the international community as to what international law applies to Israel and what international law Israel is breaching on the one hand, and the absolute inability to impose accountability on Israel on the other. This huge gap between promise and performance.
Yeah, indeed, this is the gap that we keep witnessing all the time. And even when we compare similar situations, we always see how the world interacts very differently with other situations, which always keeps us surprised and also keeps the victims, unfortunately, of human rights violations frustrated to a great extent, and with in disbelief of something called human rights or international law. But I still believe that hopefully we will be able to overcome with time, with persistence, with continuous demands. I think we will end up succeeding to advance the human rights situation. I can see that we're starting to have questions, and I do encourage colleagues who are in the audience to ask questions. There's a Q&A, question and answer box below, so please feel free to start writing down questions in English or Arabic. Both will work. We'll be able to translate the ones from Arabic to English. So the first question that I can see here is to John, and it's basically about why should Palestinians bear the effect, I think the results of the Holocaust, since this is not something that happened in Palestine, it happened in Europe. So this is a question to John. John, I cannot hear you. Please, if you could kindly unmute yourself.
Yes, I was just saying that this is a ridiculous situation. The historical record shows very clearly that genocide was committed by the Germans against the Jews in Western Europe. but Palestinians have been obliged to pay the price for the Holocaust, almost as if the Palestinians were responsible for the Holocaust. And of course, this is absolutely ridiculous. But if one looks at the whole history of the post-World War II period, one will see that the West has carefully done its best to promote the notion of a Jewish state in Israel in order to overcome memories of the Holocaust.
Yes. Thank you. I have another question. Don't you agree that more people have died in Palestine than the Holocaust?
Could I add
Yes.
a word to what John said? It seems to me important to understand that the ideas of Edward Said about Orientalism played a large part in erasing Palestinian identity from the challenge facing the victorious powers after World War II. They basically thought, how do we deal with the surviving Jewish population? And they gave no legal or moral status to Palestinian claims. And as you suggested in your question, as the question suggests, the Palestinians had done nothing to warrant having their rights extinguished in order to solve an essentially European problem. And I recall the poet W.H. Auden had a line that's relevant, it seems to me. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. And I'm afraid that's part of the unfolding narrative in Israel, where Palestinians are made to feel strangers in their own homeland.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. That's the unfortunate situation. Okay, there's another question, which is about the attacks against Francesca Albanese. So they're asking, what do you think is basically the impact of the campaign that is currently being waged against the current special rapporteur, Francesca Albanese? I'm sure you're following, and there are always attacks against her, and you know that. Do you think there is an impact for that? Do you think so? This is a question from an anonymous, from Seed, Mr. Seed. Yes. Michael, you like to answer this one?
Sure. Look, I think all three of us, John, Richard, and myself, have followed with great dismay the ferocity, and I think that's probably an accurate term, of the attacks that have been leveled against Francesca in the last year since she assumed the position of special rapporteur. The pattern of those whose profession it is to try to denigrate the United Nations and human rights defenders is invariably to look at what human rights advocates who work on the issue of Palestine have said or written, isolate words, take them out of context, sometimes turn them completely upside down, and then proceed to attack. Certainly, this happened to me when I was appointed special rapporteur in March of 2016, and that wound up continuing throughout. But I must say the ferocity against Francesca is greater than I ever experienced during my time as special rapporteur. And I think I draw two lessons from that. One, I think it goes to her particular effectiveness as a special rapporteur. She is much more comfortable with on social media than probably Richard and John and I put together have been. She's frequently being interviewed by international media and makes time to be able to do that. So the spread of her analysis of what's going on with respect to the occupation and its thickening is felt throughout the world. So I think that explains part of the ferocity of the attacks against her. The other part, I just have to say, it probably comes down to pure sexism. She's the first woman in the position, and I think that privileges some to be able to attack her in ways that they may not do against a man. That's not to say that the three of us, and particularly I think the attacks on Richard during his 6 years as special rapporteur weren't particularly. They were particularly ferocious and very sharp. But the kind of attacks I see on Francesca now coming from Congress representatives and senators in the U.S. And from politicians in Europe, to my mind, is raising this almost to a whole new level. And I think that's probably the fate of anybody who wants to speak on Palestine and who is effective on speaking on Palestine. I can only echo what Richard said earlier on in this panel, that they soon learned they couldn't answer detailed, well-sourced reports with strong anchors in international law. So what they turned to instead was personal slander and defamation. And this is what's happening with Francesca. Luckily, we have a current special rapporteur who's got an incredibly thick skin. I'm sure there must be moments when she wondered whether or not this is what she really wanted to sign up for. But I think in many ways, this has only encouraged her and fueled her to want to continue with her work and the high level of international advocacy that she's demonstrating.
Yes, indeed. Our experience with her is that she is indeed a strong woman who is willing to stand up for what she believes in, for her principles, for the human rights cause, and no slander will deter her certainly from that. So we have a question from Mr. Ma'moun Attili, who works at the UNDP in Palestine. Who's asking, do you think Palestinians need to keep their belief in the UN system? Who would like to answer this?
I think we all would. Let me just start off very
Yes.
quickly with respect to this. The United Nations, when it's acting at its very best, I think, is the appropriate forum for the Palestinian voice to be heard and to be amplified. I think the UN and the body of international law that it has helped to create over the last 75 years represents the highest aspirations of humankind with respect to dignity. The General Assembly has repeatedly said in resolutions that the UN has a permanent responsibility to ensuring that the question of Palestine is dealt with and settled in a satisfactory manner. And the UN has actually devoted a lot of meaningful resources to through its offices and its agencies in Jerusalem, Ramallah, in Gaza and elsewhere. But I will also say that the UN, alas, is rarely at its very best when it comes to Palestine. It's been desperately hobbled by its inability to act upon its many resolutions. We've already discussed the role of the United States in doing that. The inability of the UN to be able to effectively press Israel to end the orphaned political status of the Palestinians, I think, has really stained the reputation of the UN internationally. And as Kofi Annan said, he said the failure of the United Nations with respect to the question of Palestine is a deep internal wound as old as the organization itself, given that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict began at the very inception of the UN. It's a painful and festering sore, he went on to write in his memoirs, consequently felt in almost every intergovernmental organ and secretariat. So we have to keep that in mind with respect to this. And I think that I'll let Richard and and John speak to with their particular frustrations in dealing with the UN. But I think we always have to keep this dual nature of the UN in mind when we examine it and how well or how poorly it's operated with respect to the question of Palestine.
I mean, also, if Richard and John want to answer this question, I would add that there are two other questions also asking about the veto power in the UN. So I think they are relevant and they can be also addressed as part of the answer. So both questions are asking about this power of veto, which in the Palestinian experience, we've experienced very, very frequently the US using its veto to block any accountability attempts against Israel or Israeli individuals. So is there something to do about this veto? Do we have any tools that we can use to overcome this? What's the hope that we can do while there is this veto power in the UN system? Richard, do you want to start?
Sure. The veto has to be understood as part of the reality of the way in which power is managed in the world generally. And it's not only Palestine that has been victimized by the veto. Anytime one of the P5 have a strategic interest in blocking UN action, they are empowered to cast a veto, and that was a power given to them in order to avoid what happened to the League of Nations between World War I and World War II, where the organization collapsed because the great powers didn't see it in their interest to participate in it, since it didn't protect the primacy of geopolitics. So one has to take that into account. The other thing I would say is that in reference specifically to Palestine, that the UN has played a very constructive role along the lines of what Michael just said, except when it comes to implementation. So what it can do is authoritatively establish right and wrong. And that's a great influence on civil society. But it doesn't move the decision makers in the UN system. So one has to look outside the UN for the implementation. And that's why people and the awakening of the global South would be extremely important, including the region. The Arab world, the Arab people support the Palestinian struggle, but the governments play the geopolitical game. And so it's important to appreciate the UN for its symbolic potency, but to understand its behavioral weakness. So the situation on the ground gets worse and worse, even though the understanding of Israel's behavior has influenced public opinion in a way that is much more critical of Israel, including in the United States, and including if the citizenry, rather than these special interest groups, were to determine Palestinian policy for the U.S. government, it would be much more balanced than what comes out of Washington. There's an anti-democratic element to the way in which the foreign policy is shaped with regard to Israel-Palestine.
Yes, unfortunately, that's the reality. John, do you want to comment on this question, or are you satisfied with the current answers and I could go to the next question? John. don't see John. I'll move to the other question in that case. And we'll ask John, maybe I could see that there are issues with his internet connection. But let me ask the next question, which is very interesting to all of us, actually, also by an anonymous participant, asking about the Palestinian Authority violations. I'm sure the three of you have worked on violations, also not only conducted by Israel, but also conducted by the Palestinian Authority. So if you can tell us a bit about your experience, have you seen any progress? Has your communication been positive with the Palestinian Authority? Could you witness changes and progress when it comes to the Palestinian Authority's conduct on human rights based on your communication with them, or even if it's not based on your communication? So I would like to ask about this, please. I'll start with Michael, please.
Sure. I obviously would have, as Special Rapporteur, would have focused most of my work on human rights observation with respect to the conduct of Israel. But I did comment, and increasingly, I guess, in the last part of my Special Rapporteurship, with respect to human rights violations and the Palestinian Authority. And in particular, I pointed out the murder at the hands of Palestinian security forces almost 2 years ago of Nizar Banat near Hebron, and for which I called for full accountability, which would mean, I suppose, which would include the trial and found guilty, the imprisonment of those security forces, not simply those who actually killed him, but those who would have permitted it to wind up happening as well. The shrinking of the Palestinian Authority's authority is in direct response to its inability to move the diplomatic process. The rationale of the Palestinian Authority was to be a state in waiting, to be able to create a new Palestinian state, and to be able to effectively mobilize international and Palestinian public opinion to push for self-determination and an independent Palestinian state. The longer that goal remains elusive, and the further that goal fades on the horizon, the more, alas, the greater the difficulty the Palestinian Authority will have with respect to expressing relevancy. The need for particularly younger Palestinian political decision makers and political opinion shapers to enter into roles of authority and to help, I guess, renew the Palestinian strategy towards achieving self-determination is needed more than ever. This has to be something that's going to be anchored in democracy, in human rights, and in the vision of equality there. So I'm in saying all that, it is important that the Palestinian Authority begin to think of ways of radically reforming itself to ensure that it's going to be more reflective of its population, i.e. having more women in decision-making roles, having younger Palestinians in decision-making roles, and having all of its strategy grounded in the defense and promotion and advancement of human rights.
Thank you, Michael. Richard, do you have any reflections on the Palestinian Authority's record and your interaction with it?
Well, I think Michael depicted it rather effectively. I had my own troubles as Special Rapporteur with the Palestinian Authority. They actually supported my selection, but then they tried to have me removed because I reported on Gaza particularly as under the authority of Hamas. And they took great objection to any mention of that in the report. They also took a much more conservative, collaborative view of how to deal with the Goldstone report that criticized Israel's violations of the law of war in the 2008-2009 incursion on Gaza. And the Palestinian Authority basically collaborated with Israel and the US in making sure that the recommendations of that report would not be followed. So I think it is an organization that's played a very doubtful role in terms of representing the self-determination claims at the core of the Palestinian struggle, because it has been too close in its collaborative functions to the Israeli and US government, including its administration of security on the West Bank.
Thank you, Richard. John, do you have any reflections on your work with the Palestinian Authority? You know, whether their human rights record progressed or not during your mandate? I can see John's picture is frozen. Okay, it seems that there's still an internet issue. Let me go in that case to another question by Muara. She says, thank you all. Could any of you please elaborate on the political shift in discourse that you have engaged in? It seems crucial to many Palestinians, and many Palestinians have stressed that this is not a matter of struggling for international law, but for liberation. So not to mistake the tactic for the strategy. So how do you envision the next steps in linking that important push that all four of you have made, including Francesca, of course, within the UN to the matter of anti-colonial liberation itself? So this is actually a question that is really asked these days. Especially, I remember the period when the reports about apartheid coming out, while part of the Palestinian civil society, most of them were feeling the progress, which is very important, but many Palestinian civil society as well as others were saying, yeah, but that's not enough. It's about colonialism and decolonization. So maybe I'll start with John, since I can see that, John, you are with us right now. Let's take the opportunity. If you could kindly unmute yourself. Yes.
Yes, I think that we must continue to use the United Nations insofar as it is possible, but I think the focus of attention should be very much on the legal institutions of the international system, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, because it's very clear that when it comes to international law, Palestine has all the arguments based on international law to support its cause. And I think that it's incumbent upon civil society in Palestine to use these two institutions. Now we know that the Palestinian NGOs are active in making submissions to the International Criminal Court. And I think that that must continue, and pressure must be brought to bear upon the International Criminal Court to take action. And of course, there is the request for the advisory opinion on the subject of the legality or illegality of the occupation. And I think that too offers hope for the future. I think that this is a big difference between South Africa and Israel. At the time of apartheid in South Africa, international law was undeveloped. Today it is highly developed, and it is very much in favor of the Palestinian cause. And I think international law must be used to the maximum to advance the Palestinian cause.
John, I have a follow-up question for you, because you are South African also. What do you think we as Palestinians should learn from the South African experience? What are, of course, we're trying to learn from all the great things that the South African liberation movement has done. But do you think there are things we should avoid? Are there mistakes that were done in South Africa that we should try to avoid? I'm sure we will be liberated eventually, as long as we continue seeking liberation. But tell me, what's your advice for us?
I think one of the most
Oh no, the internet is not helping.
Not cooperative.
That's frustrating, the internet.
Can I make a short comment on what John previously said?
I think
Yes.
that message, I think that is a message that needs to be conveyed to the international community. So I would urge civil society and NGOs in Palestine and abroad to focus on the comparison between the facts of apartheid in South Africa and the facts of apartheid in Palestine, in order to show that the situation is worse in Palestine and that there's no reason why the measures taken by the international community, the United Nations, in respect of apartheid in South Africa should not be taken against Israel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rich. John, we missed you for a little bit of the answer, yes. but we managed to also get the last part of your answer, which helps a lot. Thank you. Richard, what you wanted to comment on the previous question?
Yes, on the first part of what I agree with John about recourse to these international institutions, such as the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. But one shouldn't have the illusion that the basic problem faced by the Palestinian struggle by recourse to the UN would be resolved by that kind of strategy, because you still have the problem of implementation. The advisory opinion in 2004 was very helpful in clarifying for civil society what the legal status of the separation wall was, but it didn't do anything about implementing it. And the failure of implementation was not met by even censure, much less sanctions. So that one should, the burden and the opportunity and responsibility lies with civil society. If one wants to change the situation on the ground. One more thing, I think that where liberation and human rights meet is with regard to self-determination, because there it is both a matter of human rights, and in this existential situation of oppression, it's a matter of liberation. And so the two things are bound together. And one of the reasons maybe Francesca received so much of personal attack is because her initial report was in a cohesive way. And we shouldn't forget that self-determination is what this struggle ultimately is all about.
Yes.
And that the denial of self-determination of a people in their own homeland requires a very oppressive structure of authority. So the two things are tied together, the denial of human rights, and in order to resist the political pressure to realize self-determination.
Yes, so yeah, the human rights system does offer us tools to also demand and to seek the same things that to seek liberation, and I agree with you actually, and thank you for the answer. I can see how time is running. I will ask one question from the Q&A box, and then I will ask you a final question from myself. So let's start with the Dr. Raja Khalidi has asked the following. I have had the pleasure of meeting all four of our stars. If we try to go beyond the cause of human rights and the world of those of us who believe in and are committed to IHL, how can we try to make IHL more relevant in the real legal circumstances faced in Palestine? i.e., how can we use IHL as a wedge into the Israeli legal system from the different legal contexts of oPt, 48 Arabs in Israel, and East Jerusalem? Then there is a follow-up. For example, Adala is currently contesting the new U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem plans in the District Planning Commission hearing on Monday with reference to IHL violations, exploration, and disposal of refugee property in this disputed Jerusalem. We need more of that sort of lawfare. Who would like to? Yes, Michael.
Let me just try to answer this briefly. Those are excellent questions, and what they really go to is what I think has been an underlying theme here, is that law, if you like, is a means to an end. It's not the end in itself, and this is why I've, as Special Rapporteur, I called for a new advisory opinion to be asked by the General Assembly to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, asking questions of whether or not the occupation is now illegal. And luckily, the UN adopted that resolution at the end of December of 2022, and this will be heard sometime probably in the first part of 2024 in front of the ICJ in The Hague. The questions that are going to the International Court of Justice, and this is of importance not simply to lawyers, but to anybody who's interested in justice and peace in Israel and Palestine, are going to the very heart of the occupation. They go to the issues of entrenched discrimination and what are the legal consequences of that. They're going to the question of whether or not this occupation is still lawful. If it is illegal, what are the legal consequences arising from that as well? What are the legal consequences with respect to annexation and with respect to the settlements that are in East Jerusalem and the West Bank? All of this, I think, if a clear answer comes from the International Court of Justice after these arguments are made in front of it, I think will make it harder and harder, not impossible, but harder and harder for the global North, particularly Europe and the United States, to be able to avoid and evade the questions of justice, because the questions of justice are all tied up with the thrust of international law in this case. The great power, one of the great powers that the Palestinians have is that international law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, international criminal law are pretty solidly on the side of the Palestinians. It is a great legal tool to be able to use in legal and diplomatic forums. It's a great political tool to be used by civil society in being able to argue for the fulfillment of all of these promises made to the Palestinians. So that's why I have optimism, is because of this marriage between rights and justice on the one hand, and the international law that supports the Palestinians on the other. And if we do get a solid decision coming from the ICJ. I think that's going to raise the temperature of the campaigns in their support, and it's going to more and more isolate the rhetoric of Europe and the United States about, oh, the Palestinians should avoid using international forums and simply should go back to the negotiating table with the Israelis. You cannot get a just peace in Israel and Palestine without the cornerstone of rights. Any approach has to abandon realpolitik. Any approach has to be focused and grounded on a rights-based approach.
Yes, indeed, that's what we are trying to do, and this leads me also to the final question. I mean, I would like to still spend hours with you, in fact, to learn from your experiences. I don't think, speaking for myself, but I'm sure many others on this call and those who can also, who are watching us now on Facebook or who will watch us in the future as well in the recording. I think there's a lot for us to learn from your experiences, and this, I look forward to reading your book. But I would like to ask you as a last question to in this discussion today, in this webinar, if you can tell us. You have already examined in this conversation, at least, and I know that in your professional life, you have examined the progress in this course. And we've already discussed this during a number of our questions. Are you optimistic for the future? From my point of view as a human rights defender in Palestine, I do see progress, at least in the human rights world. I don't see it on the ground. On the ground, actually, it's getting worse with this Israeli right-wing government who is working on more and more displacement and dispossession. But at the same time, coming from the human rights world, I do see that we are making progress. We are able to deliver the message better. We are able to be more holistic, to use a holistic approach in our discussion. And it makes me feel optimistic. Do you think I'm right to be optimistic or not? And where are the areas that should push me to be optimistic or not? Richard, do you want to start?
That's a very challenging final question. And I don't want to discourage your optimism, because it's important as a way of justifying the kind of engagement in a difficult situation.
Yes.
At the same time, I think it's a mistake to feel that if the discourse changes in a positive way, that helps solve the problems of the people on the ground. Because what I've been trying to stress throughout our discussion this morning is that you can have all the legal arguments and moral arguments on your side, and yet the situation on the ground deteriorates. What does that tell us? And how do we learn from that to understand that a true liberation has to combine law with politics? And the politics here is the mobilization of people. One is not going to get the changes from above, whether the UN or from the powerful states in the world. The future of the Palestinian struggle is a future of a people with global solidarity gaining enough leverage to force Israel to change its approach. That's what happened in South Africa. And I do think the scenario of South African transformation is an important learning tool to see how a positive outcome can emerge out of what looked like a very hopeless situation until it no longer was. And I was in South Africa a few years before Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and no one expected this kind of transformative politics to emerge from the regime in South Africa. But it emerged out of a recalculation, not from moral or legal awakening, but from a recalculation of interest. It's, in other words, until Israel feels enough pressure and enough pain, both from below and outside, it will not change, and it will not be made to change.
Thank you. You took me down a little bit at the beginning, then you took me up again. So thank you. At least you ended with a positive note, and that's very helpful. Michael?
Sure. Look, I think optimism is an essential prerequisite for the success of any human rights movement. And, you know, at the beginning or the middle of any prolonged struggle, as Richard was alluding to, it sometimes can be exceedingly difficult to imagine how this is going to end and how this is going to end well. But, you know, and when we think of, you know, how long this occupation has gone on, when we think, you know, further back with respect to 75 years of the ongoing Nakba, there are a hell of a lot of reasons for dejection with regards to this. But, you know, especially in my time as special rapporteur, I want to emphasize I saw lots of reasons for optimism. First of all, the Palestinians have never accepted their fate, and they continue to demand in many forms a complete end to their bondage. You know, secondly, the international human rights movement has adopted the vision and the strategy and the analysis of the Palestinian human rights advocates in adopting the apartheid framework and adopting the framework of settler colonialism. And this introduces a new and invigorating framework, I think, into the debate, international debate over Israel and Palestine. Thirdly, there's a growing bridge within Israel and Palestine between the Israeli and the Palestinian human rights institutions who are opposed to the occupation. You know, Israelis and Palestinians, these Israelis and Palestinians talk the same language, they use the same human rights framework, and they are, I think, in my view, in many ways, the bridge to a just and equitable future. And fourthly, as I've said in the last time I spoke, the international law is firmly on the side of those who are seeking justice in Israel and Palestine. In my view, those are, you know, in bridge or in poker, those are all winning cards to have in your hand. So that's why I preach optimism, you know, in spite of all the deteriorating facts on the ground that are going on right now.
Thank you. Yes, I think I agree with you. As long as we are working and making sure that we don't give up, it's almost impossible to lose. I feel, right? And so, okay, thank you very much for being with us today, for writing this book, for serving for human rights. I'm aware that I cannot find John in this call anymore. It's unfortunate that the call is not working very well for him, but it has been really an honor and a pleasure to have this conversation with the three of you, to learn more from your experiences. And I really look forward to reading your book. It's still not available in Palestine yet, but it should be soon, as I understood. So thank you very much. Also, many thanks to everybody who attended this discussion today. And I really apologize for those who have written a question that I couldn't present because of the lack of time. And many thanks to, again, to our colleagues and partners, Law for Palestine, Ihsan, Ghadir, and Hadil, and also to my colleagues at Al-Quds Human Rights Clinic and the Community Action Center, Zaina, Osama, Nibal, Ahlam, Rawan, and Munir Marjiye. And of course, many thanks to our To our interpreter, Arsene Akhzarian, thank you very much for the great work. So thank you, and I really appreciate having this opportunity to learn from your experiences today.
Thank you, Munir. You were a very good moderator.
Thank you, that's kind of you.